All right, well, we're going to get started. Thank you for coming, everybody. We are so glad to have you here. John, your screen is flashing green and quite wild. But we are so glad to have you here at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of South Dakota. During the month of February, we do these really fun things called OLLI Shorts. They're a half an hour starting at 12:30 Central Time, and we bring you a whole bunch of different topics. Today, as you can tell, our topic is probably Charles Darwin, if you haven't guessed by now. I'm going to turn it over to our speaker in just a second. I do want to tell you we have one change to our schedule this week. The person who is bringing the owls is not available. Unfortunately, she's in the hospital. So we are changing that session, and it is, I think, going to be really cool. We're going to have a guy who does a podcast on soccer, or as he calls it, football. But so many of us in South Dakota and in the United States don't always know much about soccer or football, as they call it in other places. And so he's going to explain what the heck is the soccer thing and why does everybody get so excited about it. So that will be on Thursday of this week. So now I'm going to turn it over to Charles Darwin and Holly Straub to carry on. Holly, welcome. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here today. This is the first time I'm doing a Zoom thing, so I don't know if I should fess up to that or not, but it is. So I'm quite thankful to be here, that Thea can help make sure that things go a little smoother. So I'm going to be talking about a little bit about Charles Darwin today, because yesterday was his birthday, February 12th. And this is kind of a nice time to be talking about Darwin, particularly in the month of February. It's nice to be talking about Darwin because that's when his birthday is. And that's also nice because that's when Valentine's Day is. It's also nice because it's the same month that President's Day is in. And it's also nice because it's Black History Month. And all of those things are really kind of tying together in some of what I'm going to be talking about today. And the other thing is, I'm hoping that maybe hearing a little bit about Darwin today may tempt you a little bit to show some interest in the OLLI class that I'm doing on Wednesday, March 1st at 1 o'clock. It's going to be live in Vermillion as well as via Zoom, and it's evolutionary perspectives on prejudice and diversity. So obviously that's somewhat related to some Darwin perspectives. What I'm going to be talking about today, I like to kind of subtitle it as Grit and Awe, Attributes to Emulate. So I have a couple of helpers here today, and they have a job, and every time I say either the word awe or grit, they are to obnoxiously put these pink cards out there where you can see them. So we're just going to have a little bit more fun than most people think we probably should be having. But that's okay. You can never have too much fun. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get started here with some of what I want to share with you today. So each year, there are hundreds of Darwin Day events held around the globe. And the events are held on or around February 12th, the birthday of Charles Darwin. And he shares his birthday to the year with Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States. So that's the relevance to President's Day. They were both born on February 12, 1809, which would mean that they would both be 214 years old, should they still be with us today. The American Humanist Association is the lead agency charged with amplifying the International Darwin Day Foundation's call for celebration, activism, and international cooperation for the advancement of science, education, and human well-being. The mission of International Darwin Day is to inspire people throughout the globe to reflect and act on the principles of intellectual bravery, perpetual curiosity, scientific thinking, and hunger for truth as embodied in Charles Darwin. So today, even though we're a day late, we're celebrating Charles Darwin. Happy birthday. Yeah, happy birthday. And I kind of like to refer to my friend here as Chucky D. Again, just have a little bit more fun with that. So he's typically recognized as the man who wrote Origin of Species, which was published in 1859, in which he elaborated on and provided empirical evidence for natural selection as a primary mechanism for changes in species across time. For that and other contributions, he's typically recognized as a great scientist. My personal contention, though, is that he was capable of making such great contributions because he was not only a great scientist, but also a great naturalist and humanitarian. And in all of these capacities, scientist and naturalist and humanitarian, he possessed and demonstrated two characteristics: grit and awe. Keep it ready. Grit is characterized by passion and perseverance. A person with true grit sets goals and works hard to follow through on commitments. And to give you an idea about some of the passion and perseverance and working hard, in Voyage of the Beagle, which Darwin wrote shortly after returning from circumnavigating the globe, in the appendix of Voyage of the Beagle, he had notes to collectors, like helpful hints to make your job a little bit easier. Okay, and collectors such as him would typically have thousands of specimens, which they would label. Okay, and they had numbers on them. And what he suggested is that those labels be color coded, so that 1 through 100 would be one color, maybe pink, and other than 101 through 200 would be green. So you could more easily find the number that you're looking for first by looking through the card. Okay, and then the other thing that he recommended is that those numbered specimens, that you would, when you write the numbers on them, you underscore it. So when you see this, you know that it's 18, so you don't accidentally think it's 81. Okay, because that 18, if you flip it upside down, would be 81. Same thing, you know that this is number 19, you know that this is number 61, rather than confusing them. If you had it just like this, 1,181 could be confused for 1,811. 1,986 could be confused for 9,861. And it would not be unusual to maybe have those 10,000 specimens. So it was, you know, hard work, and the idea of really persisting and doing what you need to do to do a good job of everything. So he was always very committed to extensive data collection and attention to detail, like things like that. So our other word, the A word, we have the G word and the A word. Awe can be thought of as a complex feeling. It can often be a combination of wonder, marvel, and reverential respect. Awe can be inspirational and serve as a catalyst for change. And I would like to encourage you to celebrate Darwin every day by demonstrating awe and grit, and by fostering it in yourself and others. Charles Darwin, the scientist, naturalist, and humanitarian, was a man of many hats. One of the ways a naturalist can be distinguished from a scientist is that one of the characteristics that's most typical of a naturalist is they are truly awed by nature. A scientist might study nature, but may or may not be particularly awed by it. Darwin's awe of nature is something he shared with his children. Spending time exploring the meadows was not something most Victorian fathers did with their children, but Charles Darwin did, and he certainly did it a lot. And I'm certain that those activities enriched his relationship with his children, but I'm also convinced that his awe of nature and his habit of sharing it with his children and inspiring his children also enhanced his scientific thinking. Okay, Darwin, when he would take breaks from working in his study. That's not called an office, it's a study. I don't know what the difference is, but it was a study. He would take breaks and he would walk around in his yard. I don't want to call it an estate because technically it wasn't an estate, but they did have acreage. And then he had something that was referred to as a sand walk or his thinking path. And he would go out and take breaks and count the number of laps that he would take and come back. His kids would walk with him. And to count the number of laps he would take, he'd throw a pebble every time he passed a certain point. And his kids famously would kick the pebbles aside because they wanted him to lose track, so he would continue staying out there with them on his little breaks. So, and I've come to describe Origin of Species as his scientific masterpiece, but it's another work of his that I'd like to focus on today. And that one, the title of it is Descent of Man. And when I say Origin of Species, when I say Descent of Man, those are shortened versions of the title. I do know that those are not strictly the complete titles, but it rolls off the tongue when you start talking about Origin of Species, Descent of Man, and so on. And that book, Descent of Man, I think of that as his humanitarian masterpiece. Okay. I sometimes refer to the trilogy, Origin of Species, Descent of Man, and the Expression of Emotion, as being his primary substantive works. There's other things that he did that were smaller. The Voyage of the Beagle, mapped out some of his travels, but in terms of his scientific contributions and where he talked about different experiments and observations that he made, it was really Expression of Emotion, Origin of Species, and Descent of Man, where he did that. And I'm not here to tell you to go off and read any of those things because they're quite the undertaking to take on. But the one thing that I do want to share with all of you is if you ever do decide that you want to read something like that, pay particular attention to the edition that you're using, okay? There's 6 actual different editions of Origin of Species, maybe even more, and at least 2 for Voyage of the Beagle, sometimes with different titles. When you're buying it today, you're buying it at Barnes & Noble, and it's part of a series, and it's really not even that expensive. But they'll tend to be either annotated or edited by different people. And so sometimes the commentary that's inserted by those people can be an important component of what it is that you're reading. So for example, Expression of Emotion, the version that I would recommend for any psychology major is the one that has commentary by Paul Ekman, who is a very, very well-known psychologist who studied emotions. And so some of the things that he adds as you're reading it is really going to enrich the experience. And then the other thing that I like to point out, Voyage of the Beagle, 2nd edition, that's the one that actually has images of finches in it, because when he wrote the first edition, when he wrote it, he didn't know they were finches. It wasn't until an ornithologist told him later that they were, and that's a whole other Darwin story to get into. But as long as I'm mentioning the finches in Voyage of the Beagle, I'm not sure how well we can see this.
Yeah, you can see that.
Okay, so when we do Darwin's live birthday party that we do in Vermilion every year, we play pin the beak on the medium ground finch with images taken out of Voyage of the Beagle. And as you can see, we have 3 different beaks here, and I've conveniently put one exactly where it's supposed to be placed on the medium ground finch, which is the image number 2 here. And so what I did was cut out the beak, made different beaks, and then we play the game and decide who got it the closest, and they get a prize. So, okay. Back to the less, I don't want to say less fun stuff. We're not talking about fun. We're not talking about party games anymore. So our friend Chucky D. Turns out that he had more in common with Abraham Lincoln than date of birth. In the USA, we generally credit Lincoln with abolishing slavery. But Darwin, too, was a staunch abolitionist. He had witnessed slavery in both the Americas and in Europe and found it repugnant. In 19th century Great Britain, the Anthropological Society depicted different races of humans as springing from separate ape species. For example, enslaved Africans were not considered to share ancestry with Caucasians that had European ancestry. Further, the norm in the populace in both Europe and the Americas was to view slaves, typically individuals taken from their homeland in Africa and enslaved in Europe or the Americas, see them as more closely related to non-human apes than to themselves.
Wow.
They were seen as subhuman, but Darwin wouldn't have them. He believed that individuals of all races were equally human and deserved to be treated with equal dignity. That would have been a radical view at the time, the mid-1800s, in both Europe and the Americas. In Descent of Man, Darwin described the formation of the so-called races as a result of divergence within a single species from what he called common stock. He viewed and described racial variations as a result of natural selection and sexual selection within the context of ancient human migration patterns. In Descent of Man, he essentially explained how such processes would lead to racial variations within a single human species. This was huge. Very brave proposition for one to stand behind, and he dreaded publishing it, fearing it would be seen as very wicked and make him an outcast. But this core work was fueled by his revulsion at slavery and his desire to explain how racial differences evolve naturally within a single human species. In Descent of Man, Darwin risked ridicule, fueled by his desire to make the races one family. It's fair to say that Darwin was an early champion of diversity and inclusiveness. I think Darwin would have particularly enjoyed a line in The Color Purple by Alice Walker, which says, "Accept everyone else as a child of God. or as one mother's children. Darwin reveled in differences, variation as he called it. Chapter 1 of Origin of Species is entitled Variation Under Domestication. Chapter 2, Variation Under Nature. Chapter 5, Laws of Variation. And he wrote Descent of Man because of his fascination with variation in humans, human diversity. Darwin was awed by human diversity. Toward the end of Descent of Man, which was written in 1871, Darwin blatantly asserted that the principles affecting change in species across time and generations will surely be generally accepted before long. I think he would be shocked to see the resistance in the current populace of the USA to the basic tenets of this perspective, particularly in light of scientific and technological progress, which has only served to strengthen the evidence. But I think he would be equally shocked by how widespread racism and other forms of discrimination are. Not only shocked, but saddened. Darwin reveled in diversity. It's clear in Origins, and this view was explicitly extended to humans and descent, explicitly extended to human diversity and descent. It was said best by Darwin himself in the closing paragraph of Origins, where he said, and I've got this on a t-shirt here, there is grandeur in this view of life. And then literally in the final sentence of Origin of Species, he went on to close by saying in his final sentence that from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Darwin died on April 19th, 1882. His body's buried in Westminster Abbey near Sir Isaac Newton. For those of you that have been there, I like to refer to that as the science section. And he was buried with full Christian honors. And one of his pallbearers was a man whose name some of you might recognize, Alfred Russel Wallace, a man who had a very high positive regard for Charles Darwin. However, his spirit lives on in the academy and the practice of good science with grit, in the hearts of those who are awed by nature, and in those who revel in diversity, especially human diversity, and in those who stand bravely behind the principled propositions. Charles Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands in 1835, and he considered this experience to be the origin of all of his views, the origin of species. One of the endemic species there is the flightless cormorant. Endemic species is a species that's found only in a particular space. And the flightless cormorant lives only on two of the westernmost islands, those islands being Fernandina and Isabella. And truth be told, Darwin's notes do not suggest that he ever saw a flightless cormorant. Okay? When Darwin was in the Galapagos, he was there for 5 weeks, and he visited Chatham, Floriana, Isabella, and Santiago. So he did visit Isabella, but there's no reason to believe that he actually saw one of those birds, and then be more likely to see them on Fernandina than Isabella. But what is kind of funny is the movie Master and Commander has a scene set there, and they're on Santiago, and there's a flightless cormorant there. So obviously the people that were doing the scientific research to make sure that what they were doing was accurate made the mistake of assuming that a bird that lives in the Galapagos would be present on any of the islands, and that's famously not the case with the species there, but it is kind of humorous for those of us that are familiar with the islands a little bit more to see the error in that movie. So anyway, this bird, the flightless cormorant, some might describe it as a pathetic thing. It's a freak of nature, which really has no rightful place in the world. Because that flightless cormorant, as you might guess, it's not capable of flight. Looks like a bird you'd expect to be able to fly. What I mean by that is it doesn't look like a penguin, it doesn't look like an ostrich, okay? But it has sort of useless things for wings. But I like to question, what would Darwin think about this different bird? I think he would have been as initially puzzled but intrigued by it as he was by the brilliant plumage of the peacock. Their curiosities. Some of them a challenge to understand the adaptive utility of the brilliant plumage of the peacock and the atrophied vestigial wings of the flightless cormorant. But I do believe that Darwin would have come to see the flightless cormorant as another example of endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, which have been and are being evolved. As it turns out, the evolution of atrophied wings would be very adaptive on the Western Galapagos Islands. This is a place where wings to fly could be considered maladaptive, an outright disadvantage. Okay, disadvantage because birds such as cormorants, which is a terrestrial bird, could easily be caught up in torrential winds, taken vast distances out to sea, were unable to return to land that faced certain death. This different bird, no freak. They're actually well adapted and well suited to their circumstances, despite the fact that a naive observer might not see it as so and think that something's wrong with that bird. They're different, they're unusual, something's wrong with them. But being the naturalist he was, I think Darwin would have been awed by this particular bird. He was pretty excited, like, yeah, dude. So, to honor Charles Darwin, I'd like to encourage all of us to be 21st century Darwinists. Darwin was no political activist, but he was the humanitarian who penned Descent of Man. He was truly an early champion of diversity in the 19th century. And I would like to encourage you too to revel in diversity, as did Darwin, to celebrate diversity, to be awed and see the beauty in the endless forms, most beautiful and wonderful, which have been and are being evolved. And to embrace the belief that regardless of who your ancestors are, what you look like, what your gender is, who you worship, or who you love, we are all equally human and deserve to be treated with equal dignity. And to borrow his words once again, as I wind down here, there is grandeur in this view of life.
Awesome.
So that's what we got about ChatGPT today.
Wow. We have one comment on Zoom right now that says, recent DNA research shows pigmentation differences can happen quickly and can reverse rather quickly too. Someone with some DNA knowledge just wanted to add that. Anybody have any questions? Please feel free to unmute, or if you're shy, put them in your chat.
I want to see you in your mask again.
Oh, I have to go back to my desk to do that.
In the other room.
I'm in here because I had to hold up the grit sign, which I was a little excited about.
Holly,
Yeah.
I am always so impressed by your vast knowledge of so many different things. What courses do you teach at USD?
Well, I retired in 2020, so I don't teach anything else. Taught a variety of things. Quite frankly, I probably got bored with things and kind of wanted to start doing something else. But towards the end of my career, I taught a lot of statistics and research methods. I always like to tell people I teach everyone's favorite classes. But I also developed a course called evolutionary psychology. And another course that I taught, there's two versions of it. The title of the course is Charles Darwin and the Galapagos Islands. And there was an on-campus version of that. And then there was the off-campus version, which was a short-term study abroad, where guess where we went? And so I like to say that the on-campus version was the most fun course you could take on campus, but as far as going off campus, it's kind of hard to beat getting academic credit for snorkeling in the Galapagos Islands. My gosh.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderful. You always pick such interesting topics. We're glad to have you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Looks like John Hollingsworth has a question.
No, I unmuted just so I could, in case I thought of something, but I don't have it.
I'm glad.
Did Darwin actually know anything about genetics? I mean, we didn't have the kind of genetics we have now.
Correct. So no, he really did not. And a lot of times people say that he was wrong about some things. And I would contend that, if you're reading any of his works, you consider the time at which they were written, what was known, and the choice of words was based on, the lexicon at the time. And, and to each his own, but I'm always impressed at how spot on he was on so many things, where he was weaving things together where there really wasn't even a vocabulary to talk about it.
So does he predate I think it was the monks where they were doing peas for the hybrid stuff?
The Mendel work was actually, I think, a little bit before Origin of Species. I'll have to double check on this, but it wasn't something that he knew about because things took longer to get disseminated back then. So he was doing it, without that sort of knowledge. And then the comment about the DNA research and pigmentation, I'm certainly not trying to imply that all of evolutionary change is crazy, crazy slow. And so what the person was saying there, is something that is the case, because sometimes things happen very quickly and things can, what's the word going backwards?
Regress.
Yes, I think I was looking. So as things are evolving, they can also regress as well. That's really kind of part of the entire process. And there's quite a few instances where it's documented of things that are referred to as rapid evolutionary change in both humans and other species.
Do you believe in punctuated equilibrium as a theory, or?
I can't say that it's something that I'm adequately knowledgeable about to have real strong feelings on. I'll just probably leave it at that.
Any other questions?
Look, you didn't mention anything about Darwin's religious beliefs. Was that on purpose, or
Well,
are they just that hard to actually determine?
I take the perspective that it's hard to determine. His wife was a very devout Christian, and he was brought up in very much of a Christian environment, but he also came from family who was known to be evolutionists. He knew that the data he was providing went counter to what the Anglican Church was saying at the time. The Anglican Church was very precise about the idea that species are fixed. Species do not change. End of story. And he was clearly saying that species change, and he knew that this would not sit well with the church. And he was known to have ceased to attend services with his family. My spin on that is largely that he was doing it just to not stir up trouble. And he certainly was questioning some of the beliefs that the church was promulgating at the time, but the church changes their beliefs across time, just like everybody else does. And I think, the fact that he was choosing not to attend services, I think, was more to avoid ticking people off and making a scene than an expression of his no longer believing it. That's just my personal opinion.
Because he did study to become a preacher.
He started out as that, because his initial intent was to be a country pastor / naturalist, which was pretty common at the time. So yeah, he started out being a man of faith like that, and evolved from that as a career path. But when I say career path, I'm using that term rather loosely, because he didn't work in the same sense that some other folks did, because Darwin's family, as well as his wife, they were both pretty well off. And so he didn't really need to be worried as much about making a living. So he had the luxury of staying at home in his study and, working out in his greenhouse and hanging out with his kids, rather than worrying about being able to put food on the table.
Yeah.
And wasn't his wife like a first cousin of his anyway?
Yes.
Like that.
And again, that was
Problems.
what?
It seems like that might have been some of the cause of the problems, because a lot of his children did not survive to adulthood.
He had 10 children, and yes, you are correct that they did not all survive to adulthood, but the proportion of his children that survived was pretty typical of the proportion at that time. And it also was not unusual for people to marry a first cousin.
I think cousin somewhere translates like spouse or something. I heard it's
Really?
something like that.
And again, I'm not saying that, genetically there's an inbreeding issue potentially there, but it was not uncommon for people to marry first cousins.
Wow. Well, I need to be respectful of everybody's time here. It is 1 o'clock. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Come back tomorrow. We're going to be here all week. And Holly, thank you so much. This was great. So much fun. Thank you, everyone. I know you can't see me waving, but I'm waving. Darwin's waving. Thank you for coming.
Nice to meet you. I've actually heard your name a few times.
Oh.
Nothing bad. I'm from Riss, so.
Yeah.